Good afternoon. Vineet Lal, you are living in Edinburgh, and I'm in Edinburgh, although we are meeting online, and quite often we've met in the street, Vineet. It's
We
always
have,
been a
we have.
pleasure to meet you. Where are you in the city in terms of area?
So I live in the south side of Edinburgh, which kind of is pretty much where I've always lived. So not far from the meadows and the university and Marchmont. So green and leafy, and I think once a south sider, always a south sider. That's what I think. It's kind of my patch.
And I'm actually going to ask you something I don't know the answer to, which is always dangerous, of course. I do know a little about you from our various conversations, but what have you been doing whilst you've been living in the city? What's your career been?
Sure. So my career's been a story of two halves, to use the cliche. A lot of my working life has been spent in the tourism industry, so working with the national tourism agencies. So in Edinburgh, that has been, as you might expect, Visit Scotland, although I started off with, it was called many things: Marketing Edinburgh, Edinburgh Marketing, Edinburgh Lothians Tourist Board, ELTB, goodness knows, we ran the gamut. And eventually all of the area tourist boards were subsumed into Visit Scotland. So Visit Scotland was my home for a long, long time. And in fact, I didn't finish up there until something like 2017. And that was a career that embraced consumer marketing, and also it was also business focused, so working with the Scottish tourism industry. And one of the most exciting things I did in that career was working on getting a lot of the new direct air routes into Scotland. So I'm talking about 2015-16. We were working with the likes of Qatar and Etihad and Emirates. And at one point, I think we were delighted that all three were operating. I think, swings and roundabouts has gone up and down. I think we've got Emirates now, and we've got Qatar. I think Etihad we lost. So that was my career, and it involved a lot of travel. And it was great, and it was really exciting. And it followed on from a career in London where I worked for the UK national tourism industry, and so Visit Britain and Visit England. In 2017, I left and I went back to what I'd studied at university, and that's languages. And I somewhat rashly thought I could make a career out of becoming a literary translator, in my case, translating from French into English. And with some tenacity and resolve, because it's not an easy career to get into, I've been really quite successful, and I've translated a swathe of books, adult fiction, crime fiction, children's books. So I work only with literature. I don't do what most people in translation do, and that's what's called commercial translation. So I purely do literature. So that's what I've been doing, and I've done it since before COVID, did it through COVID. But then for other reasons, which you're aware of, to do with family circumstances, a lot of I've kind of consciously stepped away from that because I have, in many ways, other priorities now. And my role as an activist, small a, I think, is coming to the fore, and I'm enjoying that too. So that's a very complicated answer to your question.
It is, and it surprises me that, having known you, I didn't know any of that at all. So I am glad to know all of these things.
Because I think you've probably known me with the activist hat on rather than anything.
A little bit of that. But also, I know you because, first of all, it was your mother and father who came to live in Edinburgh. Was that just in 1969 they came here?
It was in 1968. So, yes, 1968, my dad arrived in Edinburgh because he was offered a job at what was then Napier College of Science and Technology, now Napier University. And so 1960 is when we moved here, actually from Birmingham, where he'd been doing a postgraduate degree.
Great. And I will come on to your mum and dad, who are both important individually and together as a force. But what I want to know is a little bit about your journey to coming to live in Edinburgh. I know you must have been very little at that time. And so, a little bit about your own background. You were born in Singapore.
I was born in Singapore, and I came to Scotland. So when I was about three, then when I came to Scotland, um, I have memories of being in Birmingham vaguely, but actually my memory happily actually coincides with it. Kind of kicks in with moving to Edinburgh. So our first home back in the late 60s was in Leith. We lived in a street called Smith's Place, which is a cul-de-sac just off Leith Walk, and I have very clear memories of that. It was a very difficult time for first generation migrants to the UK, and financially we were really not well off at all. My dad had the teaching job, but that didn't pay very much. My
Mm.
mum was about to embark on a postgraduate teaching degree at Murray House, so we had very little in terms of income. So we lived in, and I'm going to use the adverb literally in its truest sense. We lived literally in one room on Smith's Place. And I remember that room very well. I remember I was very much a child of the street, and I know that times have changed now, but my mum would just, let me just run amok in the street, and I would have been, 3, 4, 5 years old. Isn't that incredible that in those
It
days
is.
people just perceived there being no great inherent danger, and I somehow survived. So I remember playing up and down the stairs in Smith's Place, making friends with the neighbours. There was a kindly Italian woman across the road who had an ice cream parlour, all the cliches, and she would give me ice cream. So that's my earliest memory is just off Leith Walk and going for haircuts in the Kirkgate shopping centre to a barber's that still exists today, actually. And there's a
Good.
huge sense of nostalgia when I drive past that street
Yeah.
nowadays. So those were the early days.
Mm. And and I am a little confused, I make no bones about being a little bit confused. But my thought is that your parents were both born in Pakistan and then moved through India to come to Great Britain. Is that correct? And
So
why was that necessary, I suppose? Why did they not just come direct?
So I'll explain that to you. So my parents were both born in what at that time was British India. So British India is what we call the subcontinent pre-partition in 1947. So my mum was born in a city called Gujranwala, which was then British India, but you're correct, following the division in 1947, ended up being in what is today Pakistan. My dad, on the other hand, was born in the part of Punjab that remained in India after partition. So they were both born in British India because of the year that they were born, but following the separation of India into India and Pakistan, my mum's birthplace ended up being in modern day Pakistan, whereas my dad's birthplace remains, if you like, in independent India. Do you see what I'm
That,
saying?
yes, it does. It is complicated, though, isn't it? And I'm glad
It
you
is.
explained it rather than me trying to explain it all.
Parents, the only it was only my mum's family who actually had to, in 1947 had to migrate across the new border because my dad's family were already, if you like, on the right side.
Mm.
Having said that, it just so happened that on the 15th of August 1947, my dad was on holiday visiting my grandfather in a place that was on the other side of the border. So in essence, both my parents had to make a move across the
Oh.
border in 1947.
And that must have been so. So then, whenever they decided that they were then going to emigrate um, to Britain, how did that come about? Do you know?
So that's really interesting. No, yeah, I do know. We've talked about this quite a lot. So when my dad arrived in Edinburgh in 1968, that was not his first rodeo in Scotland, because as a young man, he left on a ship from Bombay in 1952. And I know what ship he left on. It was a Polish ocean liner called the MS Batory. And he sailed on the MS Batory from Bombay to Southampton. He arrived on Armistice Day, the 11th of November 1952 in Southampton, and then took a train from Southampton to Glasgow because through my grandfather's contacts, my grandfather was in the British Army. He had managed to get him an apprenticeship to work as an engineer. at Albion Motors in Scotstoun in Glasgow. So for a decade, from 1952 until 1962, my dad had been in the UK, in Glasgow in essence, so not in Edinburgh, but just along the road. So when in 1967 my dad decided that he wanted to do a postgraduate degree, I think the UK naturally came to the forefront as being the destination of choice. So I guess that was what led him to Birmingham to do his postgrad. And the interesting story is that when he was in Birmingham with my mum and myself as a kid, he said to her, "Well, let me take you on a little holiday up to Scotland. Let me show you where I spent my youth." And I've heard the story many times, so there's a lot of truth in it. When my mum and my dad came to Edinburgh, my mum and my dad were stopped at the traffic lights at Salisbury Place, not far from where I am now. My mum said to my dad, "Edinburgh's such a beautiful city. I would love to live here one day." And when they returned to Birmingham, there was a letter waiting for my dad from Napier offering him the job at Napier. So instead of returning to
Oh,
Singapore, where they were based and where I was born, he made the decision to resign from Singapore Polytechnic and to make his life in Edinburgh, and the rest is history.
that gives me kind of goosebumps that somebody would think that and that they would have that foresight somehow. It's almost like a, sixth sense or something. But I mean,
Yes.
they did make a very, very meaningful life for both them and for you. And you have siblings.
I do have siblings. I have a younger sister. I actually had an elder sister as well, but she sadly died before I was born. So she was born in 1963, but didn't survive very long.
Mm.
And we've talked about that over the years. And in fact, I don't know if we'll come on to this, but my dad's funeral, I made a point of talking about that elder sister whom I never saw. Yeah, so I have one younger sibling, and that's a sister who lives here in Edinburgh too.
In Edinburgh. And yeah, I just find it very interesting. I think how do you find it when you come here? But then, of course, you've kind of always been here. If you were almost three, uh, all your formative years before school were here, and so when somebody says to you, "Where do you come from?" What do you say?
That's an incredibly interesting question, and it's one that I've mused over quite a lot. Firstly, let me say that, when people say to you, "Where do you come from?" I think one of the challenges that all people of colour face is that sometimes there's an expectation of what the answer should be.
Mm.
And if I say to them Edinburgh, sometimes that usually it's never enough. And they kind of
Mm.
stare at me and what they really want to say, and sometimes people will formulate it, sometimes they won't, is, "Yeah, but where do you really come from?" And
Really
they
come from? Yeah,
want a more exotic answer. And I often think, yeah, but say you were, for the sake of argument, talking to Michelle Obama, and you said to Michelle Obama, "Where are you from?" And she said the US. Would you even dare to question that she wasn't American?
yeah.
Although theoretically, I guess the answer that people are probing with me is the same as they would with Michelle, is, "Tell me
I
about your
know.
Afro-American roots," which she
Yes.
has, and I have South Asian roots. So the answer to
Yeah.
the question is, when people say, "Where do you come from?" My answer is Edinburgh, because that's my home. And and
Yes.
and and
And it
that's
has been. Yeah.
that's my
Yeah.
emotional home, and it's a bit like the language I think in. I think in English, and when I think of home, I think of here. And even if in latter years I move away from here, I suppose this will always be the place that most resonates with that word, home.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose where your family life has been. What would it take to make you move, though? What would make you move? Is
Goodness
this
me. So
is this a scoop here? Am I getting a scoop on the life and times of Vineet Lal?
you're always looking for scoops, you journalists, aren't you? That's your bread and butter, I guess. That's your role. That's a really interesting question. So the first thing to say is I have lived away from Scotland on a number of occasions. I did my undergrad degree at the University of Edinburgh, but after that I spent a year living in Japan, which was amazing. And then I did a postgrad degree in the US. So those were two extended spells when I wasn't here in Scotland. And I remember yearning for home. And in fact, when I lived in the US, incredibly, although, it wasn't that long ago. It was maybe the mid 90s to the late 90s. That's pre-internet, incredibly enough.
Mm.
And the connectivity and the ability to maintain your links with home was
Mm.
infinitely less than it is today. And I think that perhaps contributed to my homesickness and my feeling that I didn't want to stay there permanently. Maybe I'd feel differently now, though maybe with the US, maybe it would be yeah,
Mm.
not the same anyhow for other reasons.
Maybe you
Um,
wouldn't want to go at all.
correct. Um,
uh,
but what would make me leave? Well, I have to say that the political climate recently, I have found quite depressing and quite divisive. And we're all aware of, the elections from last Thursday. Well, it's barely a week ago now, isn't it? And the rise of, I guess you would call it loosely nationalism and kind of a move to the right in England, where so many councillors are now moving towards the right of the spectrum, but also in in Scotland, where we have a cohort of MSPs now who are, I guess you would say, far right or nationalist. And I think
mm.
that for the first time in my living memory, I'm starting to question the extent to which Scotland will remain that open, welcoming society that I have been so used to, and in fact is something I've championed as an individual throughout my adult life.
It's weird, isn't it? That there's so many different reasons for all this so-called populism or whatever. And we are talking, of course, about Reform UK, which is
Of
led
course,
by Nigel Farage, who appears to model himself on Donald Trump in the US. And certainly it's a first because they now have 17 seats in the Scottish Parliament, and they have come from nothing. Well, they had one, if not perhaps two, but
yeah, they
they were
have
people
one or
who
two.
had they had defected from the Conservatives to become Reform MSPs, but these have actually been elected as Reform, and whilst they possibly don't all have exactly the same views on anything, I think. And certainly perhaps not, I don't think you could use a broad brush to say they're all racist. I don't think you could do that. But it certainly does open the door to people who do hold views of that kind and being able to stand up in our parliament and perhaps influence and make laws. I find it very vexing, actually, that you do feel so worried about
Yeah,
that it might make you.
that caught me off guard, and I was surprised by it. I suppose because even despite the racism I experienced growing up, and I have lived through the National Front, I've lived through the BNP, I have lived through all of the stuff, in the late 70s, the 80s, very much the work that my mum was involved in those very early days of multiculturalism and anti-racism. I've experienced all of that, and yet there was never a sense that somehow the far right or extremism would gain a legitimate foothold. It would just never seem to be countenanced. And that's what I find different now about last Thursday is the legitimization of that. And that, I think, if you look at
Mm,
history and other countries where extremism has progressed, it has often been through a legitimate political route. And that's what I find worrying. And yeah, and I'm surprised myself that I feel that way, because I suppose I'd taken it for granted that Scotland, we didn't vote for Brexit. We voted to stay in Europe. So, we
yeah.
we have always had this persona of a country that is not the same as the Anglo-Saxon world. And yet for the first time there's a dent in that.
Um, when you were growing up, things were quite different, and we perhaps there was more racism, perhaps there was less. I don't know. What was your experience when you were growing up here in Edinburgh?
So I've talked about this recently, actually. I was invited to speak to a gathering of the head teachers for Edinburgh schools, and we had a really frank and open discussion about my lived experience of racism. So the short answer is that there was a lot of racism for me growing up. And I'm talking about, for me, that critical formative period would be, let's say, from circa 1973, 74 through to leaving school in 83. So that kind of period. So that's kind of a decade, right? From 73 to 83, that kind of, that 10-year period. So Britain was a different place. Edinburgh was a different place, and it was incredibly tough. So there was huge racism, overt racism, racism in the playground, racism from people in authority, racism, I'm afraid to say, from educators, some of it overt, some of it covert, some of it masked. It was a really difficult time. I'll give you some examples. So when I was growing up, there were adverts on TV for, and it's funny how you remember this because it's ingrained in your consciousness. So there was an advert for Cadbury's, was it Cadbury's Whole Nut or Fruit and Nut? It was one of those chocolate bars. And the jingle went something like, Cadbury's take 'em and they cover 'em in chocolate. And you know what's coming next. So that jingle would then be shouted at brown children in the playground as a racial slur.
Gosh.
Right?
Gosh, I hadn't thought about that.
So, and it's funny, I remember the advert to this day, and it was fronted by a well-known celebrity back in the day. He was a lovely chap called Frank Muir. He did those adverts. And I remember the jingle. That's just one example. There was... what was it called? There were the Robertson's jam jars, and they had
the gollywogs.
And I suppose innocently growing up, you never thought, much about it. But in retrospect, it was all part of that same. We had the black and white minstrel show on TV.
Yes,
we had It Ain't Half Hot Mum on TV, which people do defend, and I guess it is quite funny. But actually, if you think about it, it's the same stereotypes and tropes that reinforced playground racism.
It's a difficult thing for me to understand, honestly, because I'm not a brown-skinned person, and I didn't have those experiences you had when you were growing up. But I guess. Don't even really know what my question is, but I guess things like the black and white minstrel show, where people blacked up and wore blackface. They were actors, and they were white actors wearing blackface. It almost seemed innocent somehow, and it seemed like entertainment. Like it was entertainment. People loved that show. It was on a Saturday night.
It was a Saturday night. Absolutely. It was the same Blackie's Generation game. It was Saturday night prime time. And you know what? I think people of colour watched it too and enjoyed it. So I think that's the irony.
That's perhaps my point, that it was almost innocent and entertaining, and therefore how can you also say at the same time it was racist? But then I hear you saying that you were that racist comments were directed against you in the playground, which I find horrifying. And of course, that comes from a position of trying to be funny, not really knowing, perhaps, or perhaps it's just handed down from parents who really didn't know. I'm wondering where you think it came from. Was it really directed to make you feel small and demeaned and completely different and not welcome?
Oh yes. So it's categorically, absolutely. So I hold no truck with the defence of it as being some innocent, naive. Absolutely not. And I guess I don't have evidence to give to you, but as the victim of it, you I guess I'm just saying to you, take my word for it. Absolutely not. No, it was vicious and cruel and horrible. So and I wouldn't have had the courage to say that before, but life's too short, and I'm telling you now, it was horrible.
Yeah. And did you go home and tell your parents?
Yes.
Did you every time?
And
what
I think,
did they do?
So I think also my parents at that time, I think for them it was difficult too because we were newcomers in many ways, and also the structures of society. The irony is that I suppose my mum in particular was responsible for setting up a lot of the structures that nowadays exist in order to precisely tackle this kind of stuff. But those structures she had to invent. They didn't exist when I was at school. So I think that there wasn't the support and the backing from people in authority to say this is wrong. I'm not saying that there was what's the word, when you're when you're in, not
In,
connivance, but there's another word, it's beginning with C, when you're in cahoots with.
in cahoots with.
Cahoots, cahoots is the Scottish word. There's a more
Yes.
sophisticated word. um, um, but I do think that there wasn't the external support in terms of how society viewed prejudice in order to give people like myself something to stand on. I think it was a very marginalized and difficult society. And if you have a cultural landscape that includes things like Ain't Half Hot Mum and the Black and White Minstrel Show, and you have virtually no black and brown faces in positions of authority or indeed in the media, obviously you feel as if you're a second-class citizen. And that's, to me, that is an accurate picture of what it was like in those days.
But time has moved on and
Time has
things
moved
have
on.
changed.
Yes.
Do you think it's changed enough now? Or would you walk out your front door and expect somebody to shout some racial slur at you? And if they did, would it worry you?
I wouldn't expect that now. I think there has been sufficient change for me not to expect that. And if it were to happen, I would be taken aback, and I would know what to do about it, I suppose.
Mm.
Yeah, I think on the positive side, which is why I think my point about the elections is alarming. That I felt that we had moved so far, you know, and I don't expect to be called names
Mhm.
in the street. No, I mean there are other challenges which I think haven't. I think some things haven't been addressed as effectively over the decades. To give you one example, and I discussed this at length when I spoke to the head teachers conference, and that's the school curriculum. So, for example, when I was at primary school, we had this kind of very familiar mix of the Romans, the Vikings, the Victorians, with a dash of Egyptians thrown in, and that was it, and that accounted for world civilization. And
There
in
was no
retrospect,
Indian continent of any kind.
so when well, you know, India, yeah, but Africa, continental Africa, China, South Latin America, this whole Eurocentric view of world history and culture. At the time, as a kid, you realize it, and don't get me wrong, I am so grateful that I had such a fantastic education within the state and the private sector, and I have such a great knowledge, thankfully, of Greek mythology and the Bible. I know the Bible probably better than any other religious text, but thank God I did that, because it's helped me with my degree with English literature and the English language. So I'm very grateful for that, and I'm happy that I know about the Romans and the Vikings and the Egyptians. But there's a missing thing here, and I remember it was 1982. I just finished my hires, and my mum took me to London. And 1982 was the Festival of India in the UK, which was something dreamt up by, at that time, Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi, to celebrate the relationship between these two great nations. And we went to an exhibition in London at the Hayward called In the Image of Man, which was about Indian art and painting and sculpture. And for the first time, and I can remember this, the penny dropped, that my artistic and cultural heritage was equally worthy of being showcased in a museum context, of being studied, and of being aesthetically important as anything that came out of Greece and Rome. But why did it take me to reach the age of 18 for that to happen? That, I think, is the problem. I'm not sure it's changed as much as perhaps we
Mm,
would like to think it has. But
mm.
that's
That's
something
interesting.
yeah,
I want to just give them a little space here because I know how important they are to you in your life story. Clearly, they brought you into the world, your mom and dad. And I want you to give a little bit of space here to speaking about them. So if we started off with your mom was Saroj Lal, and she was a teacher. And just give me a little pot history of her and what she did and how she maybe changed things for the better.
sure. So she was a graduate in economics from Punjab University. She was introduced to my dad in late in 1952 when he went back to India, and they obviously hit it off because they were married just before Christmas, 1952. And I'm for sorry, 1962, and I'm fortunate that I've got some wonderful kind of color images of that wedding. They were married in Punjab. They went to Madras after marriage. Then they went to Singapore. I was born, and as I said before, they came to England in 1967/68. So when my mum arrived in Edinburgh, she quite bravely, and I think it was really brave because I was small, and I think she just had my sister, so my sister was a baby, but she embarked on a postgraduate teaching degree at Murray House. She was one of the very early women of colour to be doing a postgraduate teaching degree at Murray House. And her first assignment was at South Morningside Primary School. And there's no data. We're pretty much sure that she was the first South Asian woman to be teaching at South Morningside. So she taught there from 1970 to 1973. And then what happened was that in those days, there wasn't the support for childcare that there's nowadays. So it was really challenging. My dad was a teacher. He was an educator at Napier, and they were both full-time, teachers. And it was really difficult to look after two very young children. So she left teaching for a while just to kind of make sure that she was able to bring us up. And then through various chance encounters, she began volunteering with the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, and she began as a community worker with something called the Women's International Centre, based in Roxburgh Street. And that was her first foray, if you like, into understanding the challenges that faced primarily women from minority communities, women who didn't have English as a first language, who perhaps didn't have a strong education, who perhaps suffered from societal prejudice within their own community, let alone the racism from outside. And that was her journey.
But were all these women that she was then engaging with at the YWCA, were they all from Asia, or were they from all different kinds of places?
They were from all over the world. So there was predominantly from South Asia. So you had women of Indian and Pakistani origin, Bengali, but then there was also a very large Chinese community, Middle Eastern, so women of Arabic descent. It was quite a mix, and
Yeah.
my mum worked with all of them. But then what happened was that she was given a role specifically dedicated to the Indian community, and she had co-workers who worked with the Chinese and the Pakistani communities. And a lot of those early days she spent working in Leith, with which traditionally has been the home of the Sikh community in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And this, it's a mark of the change that's happened. So in those days, women within the Sikh community, predominantly based in Leith, were not as free to pursue careers, to be educated as they are nowadays. And it's hard to explain the change that's happened over the decades. And my mum was part of that change. My mum was part of the movement to make sure that women had equal rights, had choices. So, for example, she set up what she called a continuation course at what was then Telford College to enable women of Asian origin, young women, girls, to have a bridge between school and university. They might not have gone to university or further education, but she set up this course specifically to provide a gateway. And a lot of women and young girls went through that and eventually ended up either going to university or going to Stevenson or Telford College as they were then. And then she went on to work for the Community Relations Council, which became Lothian Racial Equality Council. And that really was the next kind of stratospheric leap. So she went from community work into very political, high-level, strategic work, combating racism at political level, both in Edinburgh, but also nationally in Scotland. And I know that in latter years, when I talked about her career, she was really proud of the work that she'd done with the police, really working hard to, instigate mechanisms and structures to deal with racism and racist attacks.
Yeah. And I have pictures of her working with the police in an article that we published online, sadly, after she had died. And then your dad also, I mean, I know that your mum was also involved with LREC as it became and as it is now, which is the Edinburgh Lothians Racial Equality Council.
I think they have different words under the acronym. In her day, it was Lothian Racial Equality Council. I think those letters mean something else now, but I couldn't tell you what they are.
Anyway, it's LREC. She was eventually very involved with LREC, and I know that your father was too. And so maybe if I ask you this question, this would be perhaps my final question to you. Would you think if you were to, if you'd asked your mother and father, a few years before they sadly died, if you had asked them then, did they feel that they had ever encountered racism in Scotland? I imagine that they would have said yes.
Yes.
And I imagine that they might have said they encountered it less and less as time went on, and some of it was down to their own hard work. Is that a fair proposition?
I think that's a very succinct and concise way of describing it, yes. So if I take my dad, for example, when he first arrived in Glasgow in 1952, he tells me that there were signs in those days in guest house windows that said, things like, no dogs and no blacks. That was the reality of it. People weren't, are not welcome, which is why his initial accommodation in Glasgow was with other Indian, migrants all living in one house. In fact, he told me the address. It was 41 Kelvinside Gardens, which was the house where all these Indian young men lived and would go to work. And often it was the same bed that was still warm. One person would go to work and somebody else would slip into the same bed. So the answer is yes, they did encounter racism. And I could remember being with my parents when some of this happened. And yes, you're right, that it was actually through predominantly a lot of the work that my mum was involved in with other, she was not alone. There were many, many people active in the field in those very difficult days from the 1970s through the late 80s who brought about change. And I've been witness to that. So I can see the change, which is why the political landscape now is all the more important to me because Britain today, Scotland today, was hard won and hard fought for. And I'm not willing to let that go without a fight.
Vineet, I think that's an excellent place to leave our conversation. And I very much hope that none of your fears come true and that the future is as bright as it has been in recent years. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.